Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 105th video in our Master Series and the second video in our mixing phase. So, if you watched the last video that we ended, we're talking about a leveling bus, sending all your subgroup buses and your separate individual track buses to a leveling bus so that you can fine-tune the dynamics of each individual section, fine tune them. And it's a really great idea. And then I just send everything off from there into the processing buses in the next phase. I've gotten really used to doing that because it does a really good job and works really well. The next thing we want to talk about is that I really do suggest you go back and watch that short series that I did on mixing concepts before we got into subgroup mixing, because we talked about a whole lot of things that are going to be very pertinent, and you really want to make some good notes about it and work it into your workflow so that you can do a really good job and take those things into consideration as you work through the mix. Now, some of the things we had talked about is it's really important that you really look at things as doing each section as its own mix, because basically it's each section, sometimes depending on how complicated the mix is, has to be mixed separately. You might get real lucky and you got this real simple reggae song that you really don't have to do. You can mix the whole dang song from, there's not that much change happening to where you don't have to fuss with it hardly at all on any of the sections, and you just mix the whole, from the leveling, from the fader and, on each one of the tracks or subgroup buses, and you're good to go. Most of the time you might want to do a little bit of fine-tuning automation, and we had talked about sometimes like on your out front tracks that you might want to really, depending on how well you've tamed all the other tracks and subgroups, that you may be doing some automation on them to keep them above the rest of the mix, or you might have to tame some other dynamic problems in some of the other tracks, or you might want to go through there and boost a chord here and there that's working in conjunction with some other thing happening during a break or at the very end of a verse or something like that, and just fine-tuning little parts of sections themselves, that the section itself you've mixed in, but there might be a part of that section that you might want a little bit louder, a little bit quieter, or to do a little rise or whatever, to have a certain effect so that it has the effect that you're looking for. And doing each section by as its own mix is that, like, I start out with the beginning, and I've mixed it to where it's like its own mix, the intro or something. And when I go into the verse, and it's going to go right into the verse, it goes into the verse, I'm going to mix that verse like it's its own mix. And then once I get done, I'm going to listen to it going from the intro to the mix to see how much I have to turn that section up or down. So I've already mixed it, so then I have to go back to each one of those individual tracks on that verse and raise each one of them up just the same amount up or down, because I already mixed them well, but as a group they need to be up a little bit or down a little bit so that the transition from that intro to the verse is the way that I want it. So the dynamics from that section to the next section are correct the way I hear them. So that's something to take into consideration. And also that sometimes that I'll get going along and I'll just do it on my leveling bus, like I talked about, that I've brought it under clipping, and then when I've sent every one of that, the whole mix into the leveling bus, and I just go in there for each section on the leveling bus and bring each section up or down the way I want it. Does that make sense? And that's an option also. So it's very important to come out with a really good mix. So also that, blending or retaining identity. The things are going to blend to some point no matter what you do, and they're going to retain their identity to some point no matter what you do. How much of that happens, you really have to keep in mind, because it's going to affect your mix. Depending on how much of blending and how much of identity retention that you do will make the mix sound different. So you really need to keep that in mind and not just go, sometimes not. Like I said, some people are all natural. And when I talk about some of these things, they'll be like, nope, I recorded it that way. I cleaned it up. I made it clean. And then I put the faders on there, or I do my automation with my mixing automation between those different sections. And then I fuss with none of it. That's the way it was recorded. That's the way I fussed with it. And that can be true sometimes to certain individuals. Some people are a little more picky and they'll be going to fuss with it. Nope, I want that trumpet to retain its identity a little bit more. It's blending way too much with the trombone and whatever else is going on, and I need it to stand out a little bit more so it's retaining its identity a little bit better so that the individual can hear it because you really want that effect. Depending, it could be multitudes of different circumstances. And it's just something, if you take it into consideration and think about it, it'll become more obvious that it is an issue that you should think about to make your mix come out sounding the way you want it. So really keep that in mind. The next thing is, we talked about getting things in their place. That's hugely important to make really good notes about where you put things, because you might not only just have things in their place between different sections, because you might have a moving stereo field also. You've got the stereo field and everything put in its place for the verse, and in the chorus you've done this really wild moving stereo field where all these instruments have changed places and moved around to different places, or you have a different instrument complement, so you'll have to put things in their own place in different places for different sections so that you fill out the stereo field and the spectral field is filled out well and balanced to where you know what's happening, or unbalanced. Sometimes you want it unbalanced. You might have something happening for a break or a section that you want it unbalanced for some type of effect, that it's unbalanced over here and all of a sudden it's over here and then blam in your face and it's mono. Who knows what's going on? But there's multitudes of ideas that you really want to take everything into consideration. Getting things in their place is section by section, depending on how complicated you want to make things or what kind of things you want happening to do some really cool effects to make your mix really stand out, or to get some things done that you make it the way you want it. And sometimes just a matter of having to do that because this section has these instruments and this section has these instruments. So you have to rethink where everything is in the stereo field to fill it out well, so that things are not, all of a sudden these other instruments are gone from one section to another, that, that's unbalanced, and you don't want it to sound like that. So you have to rethink it. And that's going to affect on the frequency field also, because, trying to fill it out a little bit, because now it sounds tinny in the verse or on this break or something, you have to add other stuff in there to make it sound nice and full the way you want it, because these other instruments are gone during the chorus where they were present in the verse, or vice versa, or something like that. It is very important to make really good notes of it and really take your time whenever you're getting things in their place and thinking about that, and what you're doing in there from movement to movement to come out with a really good production from beginning to end. And frequency isolation. We talked about frequency isolation. Some people, like I said, are very natural, and they'll be like, no, I'm not high, low pass and filter nothing. I'm not trying to box, my guitar into this frequency range to make room for the keyboard that's a little bit higher and this down below it and things like that. It sounds natural. It's going to blend some and it's going to mix together. Not going to preserve his identity as much, but it sounds natural, and it's like some people know they're very hyper clean about it and like, no, this piano is playing in this octave range and I'm high-low pass filtering it in there to really box it in there so it doesn't affect things below it in the frequency realm or above it in the frequency realm. And you can get extreme with that to really make your production sound hyper clean, that they're not falling into different frequency areas of the spectrum that cause it to sound cleaner, which can have some effect also on the upper end harmonic content coming off, that you got to be careful that you don't cut a lot of that off doing that. And sometimes you have to use automation of equalization doing that, so that you don't just because static equalization, low pass filter here isn't going to work when it comes up to here, that you're going to have to move it around with it so that it does what you want it to do whenever you're trying to do that in extreme ways. But it's something, if you take it into consideration, it's something to think about, because it can affect your mix and make your mix sound different. So then also filling in the frequency field. We talked about that in subgroup mixing, doing washes and things like that, that you've got either a section or a movement or a break that just sounds thin and tinny and empty, that you need to fill in. You need to add some harmonic content in the upper range and the lower end somehow, to fill it out so it sounds fuller, thicker and richer and lusher, and filling in the frequency field is a huge thing to take into consideration and not just let it go by, because it's something to take into consideration. It's going to change the way your mix sounds. And sometimes you can do a little of it, sometimes you can't do any of that, and sometimes you can do a lot of it depending on the type of production it is, the genre it is, how you see it can sound, what you can get away with, and things like that. But can have an impact on your production and make your, be detrimental to your production by not taking that into consideration, because you could have done a much better job by thinking about that and maybe taking that consideration and doing some things to make your mix come out sounding that much better. So it's something to think about. And we talked about delay from front to back. There's a delay from the out front vocalist to the guitarist behind it, to the pad synth behind that, to the drummer behind that. If they're in that type of a layering back, there's delay. We talked about, it's not that much of a delay. It can be very little sometimes. And sometimes it can be 1.3 milliseconds or 2 milliseconds or something like that. But there is a delay. Does that make sense? If you're really looking at it and mixing it from that way. So that's one of those things that as you become a really good engineer and you're really good at doing what you do, that you can do those kind of things and it really have a huge effect by causing a lot of depth in your mix, that it's going to not only, you got reverberations on each one of those different instruments in from front to back, but also you've got a little bit of delay, and sometimes not very much from the front instrument to the back instrument and the ones in between there, that is going to have a depth effect. You got to be real careful about that, because that can cause mud in your mix if you don't do it properly. So sometimes it can take a lot of experimentation and practice until you can do it and not have it come out sounding muddy, because you do that and you're probably wanting to back off on the spatialization preset that we're going to have on each one of our individual subgroup buses and individual track buses, because that's going to add depth anyway. So then you're going to have to balance those two so that you don't start causing mud. So, and it can have the more things you have going on in your production, that it can be detrimental to be adding too much of that, and sometimes none, because it's just adding mud. So be very careful about that. But you think about that and practice using it, and it's very applicable to add depth to your mix. So the next thing we talked about, delays and tunings between tracks. You can do that on individual tracks, individual track buses and individual subgroup buses, putting delays and tunings between them, depending on what's going on. We'll talk about that in a little bit more, because that's very intricate and very, delicate work to not cause mud, but it can have an effect to cause things to sound thicker, richer, and fuller, and to make thinner productions sound fuller, and just to add body and width and depth to your mix. Because we had talked about this here, delay from front to back and delays between them. This is adding depth and body and thickness at the same time from those as you're mixing it. But it depends on how much work you've done on your individual subgroups and those tracks themselves, of how much you can do that without it causing mud in the problem. And taking the equal-outness contour into consideration, we talked about that in Mixing Concepts, that it's very pertinent, that you need to turn the bass up and high end up for them to sound like they're at equal levels. Sometimes you don't want to in some productions, but if you take into consideration, there's a much better chance that you will come out with a good mix if you understand the equal-outness contour and what it's trying to tell you. So when you start mixing things together, it's something you think about as you mix. You are a much better chance of coming out with a good mix. So also we talked about mixing levels, when you're listening to your mix and things like that, and, giving yourself headroom and things like that is something you really need to take into consideration. So that comes together with gain staging and understanding what gain staging is, and leaving yourself a little bit of headroom so you can do a good job. Automation, I talked about automation and fine-tuning things. In certain sections you might automate a certain way, but you might fine-tune in that section with automation and really do a good job. Don't let that one chord slip past and not automate it a little bit louder or softer because you're getting lazy. It's going to have an effect on your production. And then remember, that, sometimes, using maximization or extreme amounts of compression on your individual subgroups or individual tracks is better than putting on the whole mix, because then you're mixing a compressed track together instead of compressing the whole mix. So we're done with this video, and I will see you in the next video when we finish our intro.